So my name's Ben Raskin. By background, I'm a vegetable grower, but I have been more and more interested in trees and agroforestry over the last 15 years or so. So I work mostly as head of agroforestry at the Soil Association. I also project manage agroforestry planting at Helen Browning's farm near Swindon, which is not a horticultural system. It's a livestock system. And then do a bit of independent work and writing. Andy and I have written a book, Silvohorticulture, book signing at 3:00. Bit plug. We'll do another plug at the end. Andy and I actually started working together almost 20 years, almost a long time ago. We helped to set up a community farm just south of Bristol. And at the time, Andy was a tractor driver. And I was co-managing the horticultural bit there with Phil Horton, and within about 6 months we quickly realised that Andy was perfectly capable of running the whole thing on his own, and so we quickly handed it over to him. Yeah, exactly. So we worked together for a few years there. We then sort of went our separate ways professionally, but kept in touch and remained friends, and both have a real passion in agroforestry, and so hence coming together for the book and for the talk.
Yeah, my name's Andy. I'm currently head grower at a farm called Abbey Home Farm in Gloucestershire. It's a organic. It's a big farm, 1,600 acres, mixed organic farm. Luckily, I only have to look after 15 acres of it. I'm in charge of all the horticultural production. So that's we grow 90 different crops: soft fruit, top fruit, and vegetables. We got field scale operation. We got glass house. We got polytunnels and a market garden. And we've actually, over the last 8 years, been putting agroforestry systems into all of those different styles of production. But we use the trees in all the different parts of the system for different reasons. And I started off, my first rural work was actually as a coppice worker. So my first expertise really was in woodlands and trees. And then I've been in organic veg for 17 years now. And it's really nice to join my first love of trees with my new profession, well, my current profession, which is veg production. And yeah, there are agroforestry in general, but especially in a horticultural setting, trees are a very multifaceted tool which can solve many, many different problems. And depending on what your farm is and what you're trying to achieve, you can design systems to help you improve your production in lots of different ways, but also to build in, and this is the main focus of the talk we're going to do today, which is to build in climate change resilience as the weather gets, all the different kinds of weather get more and more intense, whether that's dry weather, wet weather, windy weather, cold weather. Trees really can be a good solution to all of these problems. So the way we're going to do it is we're going to look at 4 particular areas of climate change resilience where trees can help. I'm going to talk about one first, then Ben, then me, and then back to Ben. But we're going to try and get through the talking bit in sort of 30, 35 minutes and leave lots and lots of time for questions and discussions, because it's a big subject and we can only cover a little bit in the time we've got. So we're interested to feed back to you anything you're particularly interested in finding out about. So we'll just crack on, I think. I'm up first. And I'm going to be talking about shade as a tool, basically. And trees are fantastic for doing that. And shade, especially in a year like this, where we've already very early in the year had very intense sunshine, bringing on very, very dry weather. But there's two critical areas where shade can be an asset to you as a vegetable producer or a fruit producer. The first one is reducing temperatures. Definitely when I started growing veg, I had this sort of naive idea that every single vegetable wants to grow out in the middle of a field in as much sunshine as possible all day long. That is definitely not the case. It might have used to be the case when we had traditional English summers, which are sort of 90% rain and 10% sunshine, but those are not the summers we're getting anymore. You know, the light levels and the temperatures this summer out in the middle of a field without trees are not where most of our UK vegetables want to be growing. A lot of the UK staple vegetable crops, things such as brassicas, potatoes, they don't want, salad crops being a classic one. They actually really don't like all day long baking sunshine, really high temperatures. if you can provide shade to your crops, it massively, well, especially in a year like this, it's going to massively help, especially salad crops, brassicas, root crops, potatoes, if you're in protected cropping, tomatoes, peppers, chilies, aubergines. None of them want really, really high temperatures. And when temperatures start to hit 30 degrees and above, most vegetable crops actually don't start performing as well. And the key things that will get affected really are with temperature stress. You'll get reductions in yield. You'll get reduced size. So growing a lettuce in the middle of summer in the longest day on really, really sunny weather, your lettuces are just smaller. They're just simply smaller. With crops like potatoes, your yields drop. And it's not just because of lack of water. You can give them loads and loads of water. They still will not perform at their optimum when you have really, really high temperatures. You will, and the lovely thing about vegetable growing, or not lovely thing, is people when they buy vegetable crops. This is not true with an arable crop, and it's not true when you sell livestock. People buy vegetables with their eyes. It's really important that your vegetables look amazing. That's how customers judge what they're buying, what it looks like. And that's definitely really is the biggest case with horticultural crops. So visual quality can be massively helped by providing some shade for your vegetable crops. The other big one is shelf life. You know, crops that have been in the sun for a long, long time and are a bit stressed have a much shorter shelf life. So you can integrate shade into your system. There's lots of benefits to be gained. And on a more technical level, and I know Ben will touch a bit more on this later, but flowering time, really, really intense sun, high temperatures, reduces the length of times a flower will last and be open for pollination. And that affects yield as well. And if you're a cut flower producer, that affects the product you're growing. So it's really important. I mean, this lovely photo that's up on the screen, this is a salad farm in France, and that's been integrated to an old orchard. And you can see that'll be in the height of summer. Those salad crops are going to grow so much better, yield way higher, and be way more visually, much better visually than if they were just out in the middle of a really, really bright field. Go to the next slide. So the other thing that comes with shade, so temperature is really, really important. You want to keep those temperatures low. And just a couple of quick facts on the temperatures. So over 28 degrees centigrade, tomato pollen starts to denature. So if you have days in your polytunnels or glasshouses where your temperatures are in the 30s all day long, your yields are going to be immediately affected by the lack of pollen and how quickly that pollen's going over. A potato crop starts to experience heat stress at 15 degrees centigrade. So, I mean, that's surprisingly low. You know, that's not an average summer's day, even in a normal English summer. In this summer, that's been every single day for the last 8 weeks for me. So whatever I do with my potatoes, that yield is reduced because they have no shade. The other key thing about shades, not just temperature, light intensity is really important. The picture on the screen here at the moment, that is the glasshouse we have at the farm. That's a fan-trained nectarine crop. And we've got those in between all the bays in the glasshouse. And they supply, they're orientated in a north-south direction. So the sun passes over the top of these fan-trained nectarines. And what that does is it creates dappled shade on different parts of the day on either side of the fan-trained trees. And this summer, we've really noticed the tomatoes and the pepper plants that are in that dappled shade, and it's counterintuitive, they are taller, they've cropped earlier than the plants that are out in full sun. So it's a really interesting dynamic thing to do to bring trees inside into a protected cropping system, but it's working really well. I'm in the Cotswolds, we get late frosts, we get early frosts. I wouldn't try growing nectarines, peaches or apricots outside in the Cotswolds. I'd probably lose the blossom every year. We can bring these trees into a protected structure like a glasshouse, get a really nice crop we wouldn't be able to do, but also bring all these benefits to the crops we're growing in there as well. And they're a deciduous tree. So when I get into the winter and day length's shorter and light's really, really valuable, there is no shade being cast. So they cast shade when I want it to. Putting in an electronic shading system in that glasshouse was almost the same cost as the glasshouse itself. The trees cost £10 each. And nature does the rest of the work. So really, really useful tool. The specific problems we get with light intensity, especially we're talking about indoor in the glasshouse, obviously drop the light intensity, we drop the temperatures. I've already talked about that. Tomato ripening. So tomatoes don't like ripening in really, really intense sunlight. In fact, what happens is the breakdown of chlorophyll in the fruit, which is the process of the tomato turning from green to red, gets seriously hampered. And you end up with a hard patch around the top of the tomato, which is green, that never ripens and never softens. So we get much better ripening when we've got dappled shade on the tomatoes. Peppers. So when we're cropping peppers, when it gets really, really sunny, the fruit actually gets sunburnt and they start to blister. And before we put the trees in, we were going to have to rig up sort of shade netting, which is a complete pain when you've got trellising of crops like tomatoes and peppers. So the trees are now doing that job for us really nicely. It's not shade all day, but it just drops that intensity. So it's not 8, 9, 10 hours of direct sunlight. It drops a little bit lower and just stops that blistering of the crop. It also regulates. It's a great growth rate regulator. You want your crops to grow nice and steady. You don't want huge spikes and drops in growth rate. That stresses the nutrient availability for the plant. So having that dappled shade in the glasshouse through parts of the day just slows down that growth rate and makes it nice and steady, and the plants can take up nutrients in a really kind of stable manner, and that helps with things like blossom end rot and things like that. And I'm going to go, yeah. And then the other big one is I'm talking about managing hot temperatures. I'm going to pass over to Ben. He's going to work out the trees can do just as good a job at managing cold temperatures as well.
Thanks, Andy. Oh yeah, got to turn it on. So we're moving from shade. I'm going to talk a bit more about wind and about the benefits that trees will bring in terms of reducing wind speed, particularly. I mean, the picture on the screen, you've all probably seen a version of that. And there was a really good session in the agroforestry tent from John Davis looking at optimal shelter belts and how to really design shelter belts in a way to maximize that reduction in wind speed. But even apart from that, there are a number of ways that wind can damage your horticultural crop. So one of the main ways is actually just around physical damage to the crop. So you got things, for instance, like leafy salad crops, where Andy was talking about how people buy with their eyes. Now you might have something like spinach. One strong wind crop will shred every leaf on your spinach crop and make it pretty much unsaleable. Still edible, but pretty much unsaleable. So that if you can reduce that wind speed, and typically you can reduce the wind speed up to maybe 50 times the height of the windbreak. But certainly minimum 10 to 20 times. So if you sort of start to think about how far the effect of that windbreak's traveling across, you can then start to think about how often you might need to put a windbreak across your tunnel. Things like as well, tall crops, things like sweet corn, where they grow quickly, they're then susceptible. If you can slow that wind speed again, you're less likely to get them falling off. But even things like that you might not think about, things like flower drop. So again, if you've got a crop that relies on flowers, so that might be something like tomato, it might be things like courgettes. If the wind's damaging the flower, then you're not necessarily going to be able to get the fruit from that either. The next bit is around the microclimates that create. So typically, if you're in the shelter of trees, you're going to be about 4 or 5 degrees warmer than if you're out of, if you've got no shelter. So that has a number of effects. First, it could mean that you might actually be able to grow crops that don't normally work in the UK. So things like butternut squash or sweet corn, where they're pretty marginal in a lot of parts of the UK. Actually, if you can shift that whole temperature 4 or 5 degrees warmer, then that might make that crop possible. But the other thing is it actually extends the season. It extends the season at both ends. And there's, so you could be planting things like courgettes out earlier. They could be establishing, perhaps 2 or 3 weeks earlier. And that could be the difference between maybe getting 2 crops of that, 2 plantings of that, or it could increase your yields or just allow you to get to market a bit earlier and get some of that higher value. Turn the page. Yeah, so the other bit then, one of the things we get around strong winds particularly is the damage to soil. And those of you that know Stephen Briggs, not that he's horticultural, but one of his main motivations for his agroforestry was just to keep his soil on the farm and not end up blowing over to his neighbour's house or into the river. Now he's on really light peaty soil. I was saying to Andy this morning, oh, not such a problem for you, because he's on heavy, on clay. And he was going, oh no, actually, it's so dusty. And when I'm going over and cultivating or weeding, I'm losing half of it again. So again, if you can slow that wind speed down, you're going to help keep your soil on your farm and protect it. And, that precious resource that is what you're growing in. And the other bit, and this is something that I hadn't really twigged. I mean, we all know that trees are really good for biodiversity. And there's actually quite a lot of evidence that agroforestry systems particularly really boost biodiversity even more than the equivalent annual systems. But there's certain things actually again around wind and about slowing wind speed down. So pollinators, for instance, they're more active when it's not as windy. So even though they might be about, if it's really strong winds, they're just going to hunker down. They're going to sort of stick in where, not go out and get blown about. So they're not going to be active. They're not going to be pollinating the crop. So if you can slow the wind down, the pollinators you have got are going to be more active, and the predators will be the same. They're not going to go out in really stormy conditions. They're going to protect themselves. But even the flowers on the trees and the flowers in your, let's say you've got wildflower strips as well. If it's really windy, they'll get desiccated, they'll dry out, they won't last as long, they'll get damaged, and therefore there isn't as much food for the pollinators even amongst they've got. So the more you can do to slow wind, the more it benefits pretty much everything in the system. Oh yeah, and the other bit, the 50 meters bit. So generally speaking, pollinators and predators will range about 50 meters from where your strip is or where your agroforestry strip is. I mean, they might go a bit further, but they start to, they don't like being too far from their home. So again, when you're designing a system, it's that balance between, with the shade and creating the shade and where the light's going to go, but also how often you plant your strips according to how far those pollinators and those predators might want to venture out into your alleys. And then the final bit, which again Andy will cover in a little bit more detail because his final bit is around water. The reducing the wind speed will also then help to reduce your evapotranspiration rates. So you could potentially be reducing your irrigation needs by slowing the wind down. So, we want wind. We don't want to stop wind. And after the heat of the last couple of days, it's actually quite nice to have a little bit of wind. And wind movement's good for reducing fungal diseases. But you want steady, slow, even wind. You don't want hurricanes and gales that are going to blast and damage your crops. I've got one more slide, haven't I? So the other thing, in terms of managing that wind, and again, in terms of dynamic horticultural systems, we had this amazing illustrator, Kate Verity, who did all of these drawings for the book. And this one I really like because it demonstrates the ability you've got, particularly if you're using coppiced species, this ability you've got to manipulate your windbreaks for different parts of the rotation. And we're not going to go into a lot of detail here, but in terms of the wind, you can see that actually that first year where it says established fertility crop, as long as you've established that crop before the wind starts, actually that's fine. It can be blown about. It doesn't matter if it's established. A low crop like that will cope. And then by year 2, you've started to get some of that wind protection. So you can plant your crops into that year that need a little bit, but not so much. And then by the time you've got up to, say, the 4th or 5th year of your rotation, you're getting a lot of wind protection. So you can start to plant the crops that really need as much protection as possible. You don't have to have a coppice system. Obviously, you could have apple trees and it'll be less dynamic. But there is an opportunity to play around with some of this really sort of quite complex diversity around heights and time. So back over to you. So just to mention that, what Ben was saying about wind, so that is actually a picture of my rotation and the phasing we do in our agroforestry system. And that the last cash cropping year is sweet corn, squash and beetroot. Sweet corn's really tall, doesn't like the wind. Squash hates the wind. I've got this year, it's been very, very hot, very, very dry, but just to really compound that, we've been really, really windy as well. And although the system's still young, so this system's 8 years old,
The apple trees are probably, I don't know, 2 meters, I suspect now. But there's a very well-established wildflower understory about my chest height. And the squash crops that are right up against that tree row, they're already twice, the plants are twice the size, same varieties, twice the size of the squash further out in the field. Squash and wind really don't like each other. And so it really, really works, really beneficial. But the other thing about dropping the wind speed that's really important is managing water, which is what I'm going to talk about now. So, like all the good things in soil health and regenerative farming, it's the multifaceted use of these things that's amazing. So trees, when it comes to managing water, trees are fantastic when there's too much water. They're also fantastic when there's not enough water, and they can play a really important role. And I have to say, I think this is the most important subject going forward. You know, I train apprentices now. I train apprentices at the farm, and I say to anyone I speak to about veg production, if you're planning a veg operation now, whatever scale it is, if it hasn't got an incredible irrigation system right from the word go, don't even bother. You know, there's still no rain on the forecast. I can see there being no rain until the end of August. If you haven't got an irrigation system, you're out of business. You know, it's really, really important. We've got an amazing irrigation system, and we are still struggling because of the heat, the temperatures, but especially these really, really strong winds. And the trees, although it wasn't a part of the original design, the trees were really starting to notice the water management effects of the trees in our systems. And like I said, they're great for too much water and they're great for too little. When you've got too much water, I always talk about trees being nature's natural soakaway. So basically, under and around a tree and in the sort of close vicinity of trees, the soil is kept really, really fractured by the roots. And everyone thinks that trees grow roots and those roots stay there forever. That's not what happens. Trees grow roots, they mine an area of soil, those roots die, they rot away, and they leave fractures in the soil. That is drainage channels for heavy, heavy rain. And it works really, really well. When we get really intense rainfall, like we've had in the last couple of years, not this year, but the last couple of years, we've had standing water in the fields because the rain's come down so fast. There's never standing water under the trees, ever. The water always percolates in. And then the other really, and again, it's another classic sort of multifaceted tool, and it's the most important thing, I think, in regenerative farming and any farming, is the words organic matter. Trees are the most amazing generators of organic matter. Their roots rotting underground inject organic matter at depth, and the foliage that blows off the trees, I found out quite recently at an event at Wakelands, you can actually map the organic matter levels in the prevailing wind direction as to where the leaves are being blown off the trees. You can actually tell the prevailing wind direction by the increase in organic matter of the leaves falling on the ground. So it's a significant addition to your system. That organic matter does those two wonderful things. It lets water drain away and filter into the soil really, really quickly, but in dry weather, it holds on to water. So the same thing is doing two totally different jobs. It's like a really, really good compost will do the same as well. So, and also water, like I said, water is the most unbelievably important natural resource. I talked about shade first of all. I'd say light is number one. If you're a veg grower, photosynthesis is the most important process that we're dealing with. But we need water as well. And we need to maximize the use of that sometimes very rare resource. Most vegetable crops are incredibly shallow rooted. So it's possible to design systems where the tree roots go out underneath your vegetable crops. And in fact, if you include mycelium from symbiotic fungi in the soil, they'll go out even further into your cropping area. What that means is when we do get really heavy rainfall, or you're irrigating very young plants that don't need much water, any water that goes past those veg plants gets taken up by the mycelium or taken up by the plant roots, the tree roots, and it gets taken back and put into the foliage of the tree. And that water is then used to literally grow organic matter for free on the tree in the form of foliage, or increase your tree crops if you're talking about fruit crops in the tree. So whatever water your vegetable crops aren't using, that tree's making sure it's making good use of that rare natural resource. Ben was talking about reducing wind. So I'm going to flick on the next slide. So reducing wind and how it can increase temperatures. And I've already said, like, wind is, in many ways, the wind in the last 4 weeks, I've been losing more water from my cropping areas from evaporation from the soil, from wind, than I have from the hot temperatures. Wind is more drying for me often than the sunshine. Really challenging. And, you know, if I'm putting water down, every single year now, the Environment Agency are trying to reduce abstraction licenses all over the country. We're on a borehole. My abstraction license is up again in 2026. I've already got, it's a standard letter going to everyone, but it's pretty angry tone, basically telling they're going to look at every single justification on the farm for the level of our abstraction license and how we're going to have to look to bring it down. I don't want to bring it down. Water means good crops, but that is the situation. So if I can reduce wind speeds in the cropping areas, reduce that soil evaporation, I can reduce my irrigation usage. We don't pay a lot for water because it's an abstraction license. But if you're on mains or you're doing rain capture for your water, every drop is absolutely vital. So every drop you don't have to use is a massive benefit. It's a hidden, but it's a big cause of water loss, is transpiration. Now, transpiration crops, so that's the water being evaporated from the leaves. It's the way plants regulate their temperatures. They let water out through their stomata, and that's what keeps their temperature regulated. If a leaf reaches if ambient temperature reaches 30 degrees centigrade, leaf temperature, if it's really, really windy, plants will shut their stomata to stop water loss. That can lead to leaf temperature going up to the mid-40s, 45 degrees centigrade. That's cell death in plants. So dropping wind speeds can have loads and loads of beneficial effects and massively reduce your water usage. So that's transpiration, that's evaporation. And then Ben talked about soil erosion from wind. And obviously we all know a lot about soil erosion from water. Trees are a fantastic tool again for reducing soil erosion and reducing water from leaving your land is really, really important. Soil is really valuable. Obviously, it's a huge subject of this event. It's all about soil, how valuable it is, how we need to keep it in the field. Just the physical aspect of having trees over the land keeps that soil where it should be, stops it all washing out the gate, washing into the sea, polluting our rivers, polluting ecosystems all over the place, and keeps that valuable resource where we want it. But also the infiltration rates, getting the water to soak into the soil. And even if you're not stopping the water rushing off your farm, you might be keeping the soil there, but the water might still be going off your farm eventually. Slowing that down is absolutely crucial part of preventing flooding in urban environments, in villages, in valleys. You know, it's a big problem every winter, getting worse and worse and worse. The more trees we have across all of our farmland, the slower that water is going to leave our farmland, and the more we can play our role as farmers in protecting the rest of society from damaging flooding, basically. I'm going to pass over to Ben.
Keep forgetting to turn it on. Right. Thank you, Eddie. So the final bit before we go on to Q&A is around the outputs in a way. So we've talked a lot about systems benefits, environmental benefits, but every tree potentially is also a crop in itself. It doesn't have to be, but potentially it is. And there's a few ways that we can think about that. And the first one that I like to think about is actually, what do you use on your own farm that could be replaced by something from a tree? So fertility, I would say, is one big part of that. This picture is an example of doing wood chip and compost and manure at quite a large scale. And wood chip, obviously, fantastic resource from those coppiced alleys that I talked about earlier. There's a really good book on wood chip. I can't quite remember who wrote that, but anyway. But again, so adding wood chip to manure makes better use of that fertility resource. It holds on to things like nitrogen, allows it to become a slow release fertilizer. Whereas if you're spreading manure or compost on, there's a risk that you're going to lose a lot of that fertility. And there's lots of evidence that mixing it with wood chip basically holds on to it, as well as providing that organic matter that Andy was talking about. So you can build your organic matter, you can build your fungal populations in your soil, all of which are going to help build some of that resilience. There is some fertility as well in wood chip, although I wouldn't think of it as a fertilizer. I would think of it more as a sort of soil ameliorator. And for those of you that haven't come across Chloe Ward and the stuff that she's been doing on perennial green manures, thinking about actually potentially coppicing some of this stuff when it's green and using it as a green ramial wood chip, which then will have a potential nitrogen benefit as well. So I think there's a lot that we don't understand about how to manage some of these crops for different ways, for different purposes, but really sort of being intentional about how you plan and use the trees as well as getting those systems benefits from them. Next slide. The other bit then is potentially your pest and disease inputs or control inputs. So I talked earlier about that pollinator, that predator bit. And again, there's a lot of evidence that having better habitats will reduce your need for pesticides and insecticides. There was a 2015 meta-analysis of agroforestry systems and agroforestry practices that showed that generally speaking, they had lower weed populations and they had lower the perennial. When you had perennial crops in between the agroforestry, you also had lower pests. Interestingly, the evidence on the annual crops was not as strong, but again, sort of having agroforestry practices within your system will reduce your need to do stuff and to intervene. And again, it's not surprising, is it? It's all about building and mimicking natural systems that can cope. And we've talked a lot about you see aphids come in and then actually you've got all the predators and 6 weeks later they all disappear and you think, oh god, I've got a real problem, and then the problem sorts itself out. And I've seen that happen particularly with our tree systems. And we had sawfly on a lot of our gooseberries the first couple of years, and I haven't seen them since. They're just see the odd one, but now that our system is maturing and we're starting to build those systems in, and I think a lot of growers will have seen that as they introduce some of this stuff. And then the final bit is around saleable crops, and thinking. So some of these are not necessarily new. Some of them I think are. There's obviously edible crops, and as vegetable growers, we're quite used to thinking about another another edible crop, fruit, nuts, all of that stuff. There's a really interesting market around floristry. There's a much more awareness around the environmental impact of a lot of our imported flower crops, and there's a lot of perennial woody species that can be used for floristry. It might be twisted hazel, twisted willow, eucalyptus, pussy willow, corner stems. There's so many species that can provide some of that agroforestry benefit, but also be quite a valuable saleable crop into the floristry. We talked a bit about coppice in terms of wood chip, but there's also things like bean poles and hurdle, basket making. So there's lots of other products that can come out of coppice systems. There's a huge market potentially for timber. There's a bit of a challenge with small scale supply chains, but again, if you're looking slightly longer term, being able to produce higher quality timber, and there's lots of interest in creating more products for the construction industry and trying to replace some of those really environmentally damaging products. Some of that is still in its infancy. Herbal and medicinal plants, again, massive opportunity to replace imports on that. It's billions of pounds worth of herbs and medicines are imported from other systems, and a lot of these come from trees that we could be growing ourselves. Again, there's a little bit of a challenge around processing and harvesting infrastructure for some of these crops that are a bit specialist, but the opportunities are there, and there are markets that we could build into it. And then the final bit, there's some really novel stuff. The picture there, the future crops one, is a biodegradable circuit board. But again, some of the construction industry stuff that I was talking about, where you're looking at creating some quite specialist materials out of woody products. So again, thinking really quite long term, not just about what the product might be, about whether there's a particular species that you might want to grow that would fit that product. And I think that is the end of it. There's one there we go. Final plug for the book. Various ways to get in contact with us if you want. There's also a couple of really good Facebook pages, groups, the Agroforestry UK one and the Wood Chip for Soil Health, if people want to join that. But we've got, I think, plenty of time for questions. I think we stuck to time broadly. 25 minutes. Oh, okay, perfect. Any questions or comments? So one at the front and then one at the back.
Hi, thank you for that. It was fabulous. Can you speak a little bit to your species choice for your tree rows in different settings?
Yeah. So species. Should I go first?
You go first,
Yeah. Species choice again. It's about what you're trying to achieve. So in the different parts, I've essentially got 3 different agroforestry systems. One's in a field scale setting, and we call it objective setting. So in the field scale, the objective setting was reducing wind, producing wood chip, and boosting insect predator populations. So the species choice in that field, and also to bring in more edible crops. So species choice in that field was we chose all of our produce is sold through a farm shop on site, all of it. We reckon we feed about 800 people a week, roughly, with all of their UK veg 12 months of the year. We were buying in a lot of apples. So we wanted to replace, in fact, all the apples we sold, we were buying in. We wanted to replace all of them. But that's not just about growing a load of apples. It's a plan behind it. So we got 13 different, there's 100 apple trees, 13 different varieties, and they crop from mid-August, all the way through till mid-October, with lots of storage varieties in there, so we can take the sales of the apples all the way through to March. That was one part of the tree choice. Lots of coppice species for wood chip. So actually, everyone always talks about willow for wood chip and for being really fast for coppice. We actually got a 5-year rotation in that field, and the phasing photo, we wanted to harvest wood chip once every 5 years. Willow is going to be once every 2, 3, and when we harvested it, would be out of sync with the vegetable rotation. So we went for hazel and for alder instead. You actually, over a 30-year period, you get the same biomass off hazel and alder as you get off willow. Willow's not very dense. It grows really fast, but the wood's not very dense. So in terms of biomass, you get the same amount of hazel and alder as you get off willow. But we could sync that harvest cycle with the vegetable rotation. And then for biodiversity, we went for basically the trees that grow in the hedges and grow naturally really well around the field and in the woodlands, because the insects over there are the ones we want in the field. It's not special insects we want to get in from somewhere else. They're just in the hedge. We just want to bring them to the middle of the field. So we went for elder, wild cherry, and spindle as well. And they had really nice blossoming times that filled in the gaps in our natural. Basically, pollen is what all the adult predatory insects eat, and it fuels their flight, and it's their babies that eat the aphids. So we want pollen everywhere. We want pollen for as long a season as possible. So wild cherries really quite early, comes out before all the apples blossom, but elder and spindle are much later, and they're like the last pollen from our trees. And then we have an understory of wildflowers that takes over when the tree pollen finishes. So yeah, we went for wildlife trees, coppice trees, and top fruit trees. And then in the glass house, just top fruit. You know, the trees provide the habitat. Any tree will provide the shade. We went for frost tender, early blossoming varieties, so apricots. We've actually got some fan-trained cherries in there as well. That's so the birds don't eat all the cherries because they can't get in the glass house. So the edible cherries, apricots, nectarines, and peaches inside. And then the most recent planting was in our market garden. Our market garden's quite old and Victorian in style. Loads of grass, very neat and tidy, lots of mowing, no habitat. So we actually get the worst pest problems in our market garden, worse than anywhere else. So we've just tried to bring in as many woody perennials, and we've gone actually with loads and loads of productive soft fruit, but we just wanted loads of perennial for habitat, for biodiversity. So we went, there's loads of stuff in there. Asian pears, Saskatoons, medlars, quinces, honeyberries, blackcurrants, rhubarb, they're all the understory ones.
You're all playing bingo, yeah?
Yeah.
Getting it all done?
Green gages as well. Yeah, I think that's it.
Yeah, so, our decision process, although the farm is very different, our decision process is similar. So what our main objective actually was around trialling climate resilient species. So we're trying to experiment with stuff. We've been growing some almonds. We have grown apricots outside. And as you might predict, we've been losing a lot of the blossom. But again, it's about pushing the boundaries. So, ignore the advice because everything's changing. And your particular farm might be just the place where figs survive outside, he said, hopefully. So it's about trialing that. We're also experimenting with interplanting soft fruit and top fruit. So Andy was talking about that, the heat on the fruit. We've lost some of our gooseberries this year because they were cooking in the heat. And they looked fine, and you bit them and go, oh God, that's already cooked before we've even picked it. So trying to create, and a lot of soft fruit actually is woodland edge in origin, and it likes that sort of semi-shade. But yeah, we're really trying to see what might grow, and then sometimes actually it's just interest and passion. So we're growing some service trees because I'm a musician and I'd love to grow a tree that turns into a musical instrument. And service tree is great for specialist musical instruments. So there's stuff like that where you go, actually, maybe, is it the crop to grow commercially? I don't know, it might be, but it could be really valuable in 50 years' time because there's not very many of them, and I've grown it specifically for timber. But it is. I think it's a combination of, yes, your objectives, what you want that tree to do, and that will be multiple things. So you need to then prioritize your objectives. But then also it's got to be something that you want to grow and that you're interested in and that will work for your farm. We do have a tendency to talk. We might not get through that many questions, but there was another question at the back there.
Hi. Can you say a little bit more about water competition? So if you were growing willow, as you say, it's very fast and it does consume a lot of water. So is there any competition between intercropping trees like that with vegetables?
Loads is the simple response. Well, interestingly, when we were designing our system there at our farm, there were very, very few places that had done. It's an ancient technique. There's nothing new about what we've been talking about. It's been in agroforestry, but silvohorticulture has been going, almost as long as we've actually been farming as human species. It's very ancient. But modern systems to copy. For me, 8 years ago, there's very, very little information out there. A lot of stuff in France, but a very different style of and different climates. It wasn't that applicable to the Cotswolds. But interestingly, Wakelands, one of the pioneering agroforestry places in the country, the one bit of data that they categorically had was where they got very thick willow coppice tree rows, and they grow potatoes in those alleys on rotation some years. And in the really hot years, they got significant negative yield impact on potatoes from the willow, and that meant we deliberately didn't plant any willow in the middle of our vegetable fields for that exact reason. And the second thing, any tree is going to compete with your vegetable crops for water. And again, there are so many things we could have talked about today, but which we can't get into just this short amount of time. Root pruning is a really important subject. You don't want your tree roots going out and growing amongst at the same kind of like vertical level as your vegetable roots. They will directly negatively affect the access of nutrients and water for your vegetable crops. Ideally, what you do is you prune the roots down to a depth of 50 centimetres or put in a physical barrier, and that forces the tree roots to grow underneath your vegetable crops. That way they're acting as a safety net, which picks up those nutrients and that water once it's gone past your crop, rather than competing at the same vertical strata as such. Does that make sense?
I think, and it's also worth adding that in a really dry year, it's the water competition that's a problem. But in another year, it might be something else. So the other thing that came out of that Wakelands and potato thing is in a bad blight year, the tree rows slowed down the progression of blight across the field. So it meant that some of the potato crops at the far end of the field got an extra 2 or 3 weeks of growing before they got blight. So in a wet year, actually, those willows were beneficial. And this, for me, is what it's all about. It's about building that diversity and resilience, because we don't know if we knew it was going to be dry every year, it'd be easy. We could design a system that coped with that. But we don't know that. It's going to be really dry one year. It's going to be really wet another year. And it'd be wet at different times. So it'd be wet when the potatoes are being harvested, or it'd be wet when something else is happening. So yeah, you have avoided willow because that's a particularly big risk for you. But actually, there are other things that you might not have thought about. So again, probably don't design the same system across your whole farm, but have different bits, because that will give you more flexibility and more resilience against a wider range of things that might happen.
Yeah, and I think if you really, if one of the end products you really wanted was from willow, it's not to say you don't use willow. You just, the way you designed the system would have to take that into account as a potential risk. So you might have quite a wide tree row, and you might have a line of willows down the middle of that tree row, but then have some less vigorous trees on the outsides of that tree row, so that you're keeping a bit of a distance between the veg crops and the willow trees.
Any other questions? Yeah, one at the sort of in the middle here at the, yeah.
Hi, yeah, thank you very much. That was really good. I just wanted to ask quickly, you obviously growing trees as compared to sort of annual or maybe perennial crops, you're suddenly going towards a plant that you have to have some idea of what the future's going to look like, because you're hoping this plant is going to be alive for a decade or 2 or 3 or 4 decades. How do you approach that compared to when you're choosing what crops to grow? How do you approach species with an eye on what the climate's going to look like in following decades? Yeah,
I mean, it is hard, and it's, again, both Andy and I come from an annual cropping background. You go, oh, that didn't work, try something else next year. And one of the reasons we've slowed down our planting at Eastbrook is because it takes a long time to learn. There's the almonds, for instance, okay, planting them on heavy clay in North Wiltshire maybe wasn't a very bright idea, but they looked brilliant for the first 6 years, and I thought, this is great. And then we had a really wet winter, not this one garden, but the one before, and we lost quite a few. So suddenly I'm thinking, okay, well, maybe I shouldn't plant them at all. But then actually some of them have still survived and are doing really well. And so it's, you're learning more and more. But if I'd suddenly gone, yeah, the almonds are growing really well, I'm going to plant them everywhere, then that would have been a mistake. So there's definitely an element of trialing some of this stuff and not rushing into it. Whereas, I mean, we do that, I guess, on annual crops a bit, but you can be probably a bit more blasé, I think, with annual crops, because if it doesn't work, you can have another go next year. But is that?
I mean, I think the key thing, like every aspect of my production system, and I know same with Ben's, diversity is absolutely key. So you wouldn't just go in and plant one species from one provenance all over the farm, because that's inherently risky. We grow 90 different kinds of fruit and vegetables. We don't get a weather pattern that makes it's impossible for there to be a weather pattern that makes all 90 crop commercially. As long as I say 65 or over crop really, really well, and it's a different 65 every year, then that keeps us financially viable. And I think that's the same with trees in an agroforestry system. For so many reasons, diversity is really important. Even if you're just doing apples, you need loads of different varieties. It's much more resilient against disease, weather, frosts, all of these things. And then the other thing about future-proofing is provenance, and where you get your trees from, and what species, what varieties. There's loads of different kinds of hazels. The hazels that grow in Spain are very different to the hazels that grow here. I know HS2, when they were doing tree replacement for HS2, quite a lot of the trees they were planting for that, their provenance was Mediterranean. They were getting trees. Now, I know with ash dieback, the concept of importing trees that grow here from abroad has massive negative implications potentially, but these trees can be inspected well for diseases. Those ashes that came in weren't. That was the problem. But yeah, getting varieties that grow in the Mediterranean in your system, but just getting, hazel grows great here, but Spanish hazel will be much more future-proofed against drought and intense heat than traditional north of England hazel or something like that.
The other thing that I'm really interested in about with fruit and nuts is actually around, more genetic diversity within it. I'm really concerned with almonds at the moment. As far as I can work out, virtually every almond tree planted in the UK is one of 2 species. That's not terribly resilient. And similarly, things like peaches and stuff. I was given 2 years ago a species peach tree, which has been bred by Bee Happy Plants down in Somerset. So she's been selecting and breeding effectively open pollinated peach trees. So within a stand of trees, then you've got genetic diversity, which gives you hopefully more resilience. Because as soon as we've got a bunch of clones in the field, we're we're more at risk. And I think a lot of fruit has been driven by, here's that perfect new variety, and so we're going to plant 40 acres of that variety. And that, that's a disaster really waiting to happen. So diversity of species, but also diversity of genetics within that.
And worldwide, there's a huge problem with Cavendish bananas. They're all clones. So there's disease just sweeping across the world that is going to kill every single Cavendish banana once it gets to those countries. And it's exactly what's going on with olives in the Mediterranean. They're all cuttings. They're all genetically identical. There is some diversity, but vast swathes in countries, these olive trees are genetically identical because the Romans went around with bunches of cuttings planting all these trees. That is an inherent danger as far as disease resilience is concerned.
Any more questions? I think we've got time for one or two more. Yeah, at the back on. Oh, was there another one there, sir? Should we do that one and then that one? Is that right? Yeah? Do that one and then the one at the front, yeah.
Thanks, guys. Any comparison between syntropic and what you're doing?
I don't know enough about syntropic. I've been getting more interested in it. I think I'm doing it in my front garden at the moment. But we're not mostly doing it at the farm. But I did confess I'm no expert on it.
I get this. It's interesting. I get asked this question at every single presentation. It's really interesting. I essentially I see English agroforestry like this is very slow motion syntropics, which probably means it's not syntropics. But yeah, there are definite parallels. But it's I think the speed of growth. I know that. I mean, there's people doing syntropics down in Cornwall, But my growth rates are significantly slower on any crop than they are in Cornwall. But there are UK willow, for example, grows very, very fast, and there are various understory plants that grow very, very fast. So yeah, I think there's loads of parallels, but it's that speed and the number of crops you can get in one season out of a syntropic system. I think it's different. I suppose the mirror, when I say very slow motion syntropics, you can design agroforestry systems that evolve over 100 years. So, a good example of this would be an old Kentish orchard technique. So when they used to plant a new orchard in Kent, they'd go into the field, they'd plant, 10 metres apart, rows of apple trees. But those apples didn't earn them any money for the first 4, 5, 6 years. So the rest of the field, right up to the bottom of the apple trees, they went into veg production. And as the trees got bigger and bigger and cast more and more shade, and then you have to get in with harvesting equipment and trailers and people getting in there, slowly they drop the veg out of that. There's also the option of planting timber trees early on. A really tall timber tree doesn't go very well with horticultural crops. There's too much shade. And there's an evolution from silvohorticulture to then maybe silvo-arable, and then maybe after 60 years you're into silvopasture, and then maybe you cut it all down and then you start again. So in that's how I see it, as a very slow motion syntropics.
One final question at the front there.
Thank you. Considering a windbreak, tree rows as windbreak, is it more important that they're positioned against the prevailing wind, perpendicular with the prevailing wind, or are they always grown north-south?
So I would say yes, prevailing wind is probably, if that's your main objective is wind, then as much as you can get them against the prevailing wind is good. For a lot of people in the UK, that north-south works pretty well as well, so you get the light benefit. But when you're designing a system, there are all of these competing factors. So you need to look at light, you need to look at wind, you need to look at slope, your access, the shape of the field, 100 different things, and all of those you need to consider and prioritize within that. But if you plant in rows with the prevailing wind, you'll just create a wind tunnel and exacerbate it. So yeah, absolutely.
So it's important to add to that. There's two things where this often comes up. Windbreak, you quite often end up not going north. If you're prevailing wind, for me, luckily it's the southwest. So it's southwesterly, so I can go north-south tree rows. It gives me pretty good protection, but also I get good light, But if your prevailing wind's from a completely different direction, you may well end up putting your trees east-west, And the same often comes up if you're on a south-facing slope, and what you want to do is stop soil erosion. your tree rows are going to go east-west. And the important thing there is to understand that just because you're going east-west, you're going to cast shade on the northern side of the trees in the northern hemisphere. That's not the end of the world. There's loads of techniques you can do to cast less shade. So you can grow small trees, smaller. You can have them on small rootstock. You can coppice or pollard them to keep the height down, but still get some windbreak effect or still get soil erosion management. Or you can space the trees out or you can lift the canopy of the tree up. So light can get in underneath the trees and give you some light behind the trees. Yeah. But yeah, led by your objectives. Whatever your number one objective is what you should go with.
Great. Thank you all very much for listening. We'll be at the bookshop in 5 minutes or so if you do want to come and buy a book. Thank you very much.